Tim, free will, it's something that has occupied philosophers for generations. Now, scientists, everybody has their attitude, their approach to it. What you are participating in is a new effort to see if experimental design can cast information and new data upon these age-old questions. What's your experiment, and how can you hope to have an impact on free will?
The question that we're interested in is the relationship between perceptual consciousness, in particular, but consciousness more generally as well, and free will. And free will insofar as it involves control. So there are very broad philosophical questions about whether control of your behavior, control of your actions, control of the mental processes, how that hooks up to free will. And we're not trying to tackle that part of it. We're just focusing on the question of how perceptual experience is related to control, and it allows one to control various aspects of mental functioning. Our project is investigating the functions of perceptual awareness, perceptual consciousness. So we know the mind is full of unconscious bits of information. We register all sorts of features of the environment where those registrations don't make it into consciousness. We're unaware of them. And we know for many, many years, an increasing body of work has shown that all that information can prime, can modulate, can direct, can influence cognitive functions, can influence action. But we also believe, and it's a belief that's central to many of our attitudes about consciousness, that consciousness is important and necessary for certain types of action, for certain types of functions. Let me give you an example of how this assumption bears out. So patients who are in a vegetative state can do very little. They seem to go through the sleep-wake cycle, but they won't respond to commands. And a recent work in using an fMRI study, functional magnetic resonance imaging study, asked a patient to engage in some voluntary imagery. They asked this vegetative state patient to imagine walking around her house for 30 seconds, and then asked her to imagine playing tennis for 30 seconds. And we know that these types of imagery, because they involve different types of behavior, different contents, trigger different types of the brain. And they looked at her brain patterns over this 30 seconds, and it looked like she was following these commands. And the authors of this study lead author was Adrian Owen when he was in Cambridge, concluded that she was conscious, even though she hadn't engaged in any outward behavioral manifestations of consciousness. The clinicians would have thought she was conscious, did think she was conscious. They said she's in a vegetative state. The reason why, as I would reconstruct this experiment and the interpretation, the reason why they took the neural activation to be evidence of consciousness in this patient was that they took the neural activation to be evidence of agency, voluntary agency. She was following their commands for 30 seconds. She was imagining walking around her house. She was imagining playing tennis. So that's a manifestation of the link that many people find very plausible between certain types of action, intentional action, voluntary action, and consciousness. And what we're investigating in our
So that's the nexus between consciousness and free will.
Exactly.
Because you need the consciousness to have the volition to...
That in a nutshell is the idea. And then the question is, well, there's different kinds of consciousness, there's different kinds of volition. Which kinds of consciousness do you need for which kinds of volition, and under what conditions?
So how does your experiment achieve that?
What we're interested in is the degree to which you can modulate certain types of action, certain types of categorization, certain types of behavior using unconscious stimuli. So you mask the stimuli, or you present them so they're below the threshold of awareness, and then you see how those stimuli will modulate or manipulate the person's behavior. And if you can get robust, high-level modulations, if you can manipulate the person's behavior in ways which, in these sort of robust ways, then that undermines the thought that consciousness is necessary for voluntary behavior or intentional behavior.
Because you're doing
it
so
with
much unconsciously
Exactly.
that the importance of consciousness in free will would be less. Is that your thesis?
That's right. It would be more, it would certainly be, the importance of consciousness would certainly be less direct. So, I mean, the experimental work will not show, it's not designed to show that there's no connection.
Of course.
But it is designed to probe the limits of unconscious control.
To see the degree to which unconscious stimuli can affect actions.
It affect actions, and in particular, the kinds of actions that we think are most closely associated with free will. Decision-making, deliberation. So we know that unconscious information can affect actions in that sort of a low-level, automatic kind of way. But the sorts of actions which we think are most intimately associated with free will, decision-making, deliberation, it's very controversial whether unconscious information can modulate or influence those actions.
So give a sense of what the boundary conditions are. What's the most radically different results that you might get? You'll probably get something in the middle, but define the extremes.
Well, the extreme position would be there are all of the kinds of action that are really associated with, most intimately associated with free will, that you can't modulate those kinds of actions with unconscious stimuli at all. That's one extreme.
And what are some of those actions, for example?
Well, for example, deliberating about two courses of action that you've got in mind.
Okay, so you have two courses of action, and then you're feeding some subconscious stimuli.
Exactly.
And one extreme is that they have no effect whatsoever.
Exactly. That would be one. That would be one extreme. At the other end of the spectrum would be a very surprising result, which would be a result which would show that anything you can do with conscious stimuli, you can do with unconscious stimuli. Now, I myself think that it's unlikely, that there's reasons to think you could never show that result. And the reason is, to show that result, you have to know the person's conscious of the stimuli in one condition and unconscious of the stimuli in another condition. Now, how do you show that they're conscious? That's a very important question. We often rely on voluntary action to ascribe consciousness.
So it becomes circular.
So it becomes circular. You have a sort of a methodological guarantee, because if someone can't, put it this way, if someone does use the stimuli in a rich, robust, flexible way, if you give them the rose and you say, can you pick up the rose, can you describe the rose, you engage with it in a voluntary way, then I'm going to say you're conscious.
Sure.
That's about as good an evidence as we have that someone's conscious.
What's your hope in this study?
My hope is that we make some progress in pulling apart different types of control. So we talk about intentional action. We talk about voluntary action. These terms are used not just in common sense in everyday life and in the legal context, but they're also used in psychology and philosophy. And they're blunt instruments. It's all sorts of different contexts and conditions. There's voluntary control when we're tired, when we're stressed. There's voluntary control in response to familiar cues. So you're at the stoplight, and the light goes from red to green, and you press the pedal. That's voluntary behavior, but it's automatic. It's automatized. You've been doing it for years. That's very different kind of control from making a life and death decision. From the Sophie's Choice kind of case. That's a very different kind of control, but we use the same blunt instrument to characterize both. So I would like to draw on the neuroscience and develop a more fine-grained taxonomy, a more fine-grained sense of the different types of control, and at the same time draw on the science of consciousness to develop a more fine-grained sense of different types of consciousness.
To sharpen these blunt instruments.
To sharpen these blunt instruments, so we might get a better sense of hypothesis. We're not even in a position to really construct the hypotheses that we want because our language is blunt. So we need to sharpen the instruments so we can then sharpen the hypotheses so that we can then go back to the experimental work and get a clearer sense of the relationship between consciousness and free will.